people in the very front move elsewhere. That one in particular. I would like some of the people who are in the very front if they could move, say, towards the corner or the back. That would be unusual. Exactly. And I'm starting to get calm now. Now that everything's like set up and working.
Not many people here.
Yeah. A little sad.
And it's
talk about
something new, or
it's what we talked about. ISP.
no, Westport, the up and coming.
Yeah.
Was the ISP hackathon?
Yeah, actually, it was really interesting. Yeah, we ended up doing a talk of like best practices that I thought I thought it was really interesting. I think it kind of went over the head of a lot of the people there because they hadn't done anything with it yet. And that's what. Did you get invited to the talk or the conversation on Monday morning from Brian Exeter about best practices?
Like next Monday?
Yeah.
No.
Okay, I'll try to get you added to that.
I guess it's really part of the up and coming.
Right. So what we're trying to do? Yeah. Just remind me after. But the part of the CDK is over at Dawn that is like the best practice thing. So they need some content. See, I gotta do presentations about security. Docker. I guess this is about Docker. Kind of.
But have you had word Docker in your proposal?
I think I did. Maybe. I'm not sure. I had container.
Yeah, container, but it's not.
I know. I'm gonna work on my marketing.
Yeah, we need keywords, right?
Right. So have you been in this room all day? Have you been in this room? Have many of the talks been busy? Like what was the busiest?
I think dance.
Dance.
So I think we can start.
Okay.
Good afternoon. Let me introduce to you Langdon White, platform architect for developer experience. And he will be, again, talking something about containers and how to make it useful for developers.
Hi, so is this thing on? I normally can be heard just fine, so as many people know. I'll try to keep my voice down for the microphone. My name is Langdon White. I do a lot of stuff with developers. I spent about 15 years as a software consultant, both as like an actual consultant, an architect, a manager, a VP of engineering, basically every single job I think you can have that doesn't actually require work, I think I had. So that's kind of where I come from. And this talk is really about what could we be doing differently in this kind of age of containerization for ourselves. So first and foremost, I wanted to talk about Joe. So Joe is a friendly developer, and he is a big fan of Dev Assistant. And if you go to another Dev Assistant talk, you may hear more about Joe. So a little shout out to Slavik over there. But Joe's a developer, and he is constantly worried about a few things. One, that when he gets the latest and greatest version of some new tool, that everything else on his machine is going to break, right? So you go and install the beta version of blah, 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 and now all of a sudden you can't read your email, and you can't use IRC, and you can't do whatever. So this is kind of a pain, right? So often we're very fearful of installing things or trying out new things because we're afraid we will bust the rest of the box, which is, if you watch my ABRT in the bottom of my Fedora laptop, is basically a constant stream of you broke me on some new and different way every day. Another thing is when you get a new computer. Here we have a very nice Trash 80 that you guys might be lucky enough to get. So you move to a new computer, or you want to upgrade your operating system or whatever, and then you think about how many days will it take me to get to be productive again once I, kind of get the machine. Does everybody somewhat agree with me so far? You think I'm totally crazy? Anyone? Oh, all right. Yeah, all right. Thank you. At least we've established some components. So those are some of the problems. I'm sure you guys can think of a lot more. This is kind of some of the areas that I was just kind of thinking about. And so there's one more that we kind of are really starting to see these days, which is polyglot programming, right? So it is increasingly common for someone to have to work in multiple languages in kind of 1 week, right? If not 1 day. And as a result, the tooling for those languages is often quite different. So how do you maintain the kind of different sets of tooling without kind of stomping on each other? Like I said, this is kind of increasing, and I know this from personal experience. My best example usually is Eclipse, right? So Eclipse tends to start to fall over with the number of plugins you attach to it. So if you have all the Java plugins and you want to do all the Python plugins, you don't want to do those together. So now you have to have separate installs, which means you can't actually use the ones that are coming in through like yum update. So now you also have to manage the maintenance of them. So it just gets even more fun over time. And as I was kind of getting at, is we're going to talk about some solutions to these. So and I just wanted to throw out there, if you notice there's a squirrel there, but the other squirrel that I really wanted to use, I couldn't use because the guy hadn't put a license on it. So remember, put licenses on your software. So there's lots and lots of different ways people have attempted to solve this problem. One of them is using source control. So just put your entire computer in Git, right? And use some remote server to synchronize it with, and then you can recover from that. And that's, I'm sure, if anybody who's actually tried that is really a lot of fun, particularly when you start talking about binaries, et cetera. Sorry about that. There's another cool little tool called Etsy Keeper that basically tries to manage the commits and stuff for you, which is really nice. It's a nice little tool. The problem is it has exactly the same problem because the back end of it is your preferred source control system. So those are, they work. Some people have them working a lot better than others. Actually, I think Colin Walters showed me one of the most impressive versions of this that I've ever seen. And then he went and built OS Tree, basically because it was really bothering him. So another model to try to solve this is to actually use config management tools. So because you didn't have enough to learn, let's add a whole new DSL of some kind to whatever you're doing, and then a whole library of files that you got to maintain in whatever one you happen to use. There are some potentially interesting advantages here because if you can find good Puppet modules for like HTTPD, right, you might be able to use that yourself for your own development work. Except those are almost always targeted at production, right? So they're not actually useful when you're trying to do development without getting heavily, heavily broken. So my proposal is, what about containers? And I get very, very tired of constantly seeing shipping containers. So every time I do a talk, I try to figure out a new and different kind of container. So here we have flower pots. So this is some of the thing I was thinking, right? So what if we could, instead of installing all this stuff locally, we could instead try to make containers out of the tools that we use, and then make them work together via the normal orchestration mechanisms that we use for containers in general. And that starts to potentially get really interesting. So first of all, we have kind of the IDE, right? I'm kind of throwing in text editors and all that stuff in here. But we could just install Eclipse inside a container, right? And then use various mechanisms to actually share the UI of that across to your desktop, right? What I think is maybe even more interesting is to start to look at online editors. So Che is a relatively recent project of the Eclipse Foundation that is actually a donation from a company called CodeEnvy that is an online IDE that has some really nice synergy with existing Eclipse plugins. Orion is also an online IDE by the Eclipse Foundation. The difference between the two is I think that Orion is much more like text file editor kind of approach, whereas Che is more like Eclipse IDE approach. So if you like VI, you'd be more likely to like Orion, but if you like Eclipse, you'd be more likely to like Che. Atom is another one made by GitHub that's pretty slick. But the point being is that, you know what I just realized? I should have put the last slide first. Is that the point being is that you could kind of store all of this configuration in one place that is actually movable now, right? Because it's a container. You can run it anywhere. And on top of that, you can start to version the thing, right? So you could actually have two different copies of the container that runs your Eclipse or whatever that has the different sets of plugins that you want, right? Then you could take something like Dev Assistant, right? And you could actually say to Dev Assistant, you could just say, oh, go get me the container that was created for VI for Python by Joe because he's an awesome Python developer and I know he's got some magic VI tricks up his sleeve. So that starts to get, I think, pretty interesting. Next thing is going back to that kind of polyglot programming problem, as well as, and perhaps you've experienced this, I know I've never experienced this, when your boss comes screaming in and worried about some bug because the customers are freaking out and leaving in droves and wants you to work on it right now. All right, so well, what about the big, huge monster thing you were already working on? I mean, this was one of the really nice things about Git, right, is that you can actually kind of store your position, right, and then go off and work on something else without the massive overhead that would be in Subversion, for example. But what if, as well as that, you could actually store all of the places where you have browser tabs open to, right? Because I don't know about any of you, but I basically, a major requirement of my software development now is essentially Google. But like lots and lots of browser windows open with documentation, with code examples, with whatever. When I was setting up for this talk, I had to close the, I think 6 or 8 windows with 40, 50 tabs each before I could, present this talk. Now, imagine that you could then just store all those away while you worked on problem 1, and then switch to problem 2, and open up a whole new set of tabs. Well, what we could do is we could put Firefox's sync server in a container, right? And then you could sync your Firefox to your container, and now your container is the one that actually stores your history and your plugins and all that other stuff. If you're a web developer, I don't know, again, how many people are web developers, there's, again, a lot of different plugins for, like, Firefox that you want sometimes. So if you do Drupal development, there's a really nice Drupal plugin that lets you debug Drupal from Firefox, but you don't really want to have that installed when you're working on WordPress. So ad infinitum. All right, so then we get into source code, right? So what if we also had, and I come from Subversion, so I still say it this way, but essentially your Git server, right, inside a container. So if you have that container be your upstream, right, then you could kind of commit back and forth or whatever, and then the real upstream could be behind it, right? So what could that do? Well, that makes you able to commit stuff and and push it and all that jazz while you're offline, right? And then on top of that, you could actually just have a little service that runs inside that container that periodically pushes it to the real upstream, right? So that starts to, I think, getting kind of interesting as well. And then, if you're a GUI guy like me, then you can also have like GitLab, installed in the container, and then you just have it right there in your browser. But again, it's portable, right? It's versionable. And you can do all kinds of crazy stuff with it. The last example I'm going to give for kind of some of the things that would go into this potential architecture is what about something along the lines of what I refer to as personal CI, right? And what I mean by that is when you're first developing a piece of code, it could be a new project, it could be just a new feature or whatever, there's a point early on where it's complete junk, right? Hopefully, it doesn't stay that way. But so what happens then is you don't really want to put it in any kind of public, right? That public might be, in the open source world, right on the internet. It could be in public, even in an enterprise. You don't want to share it yet. But at the same time, you want to be developing it in such a way that you have, kind of that whole tool chain that you're going to be integrating with during the actual development phase, once you get past that point. So what we could do there is we could actually give you something like Jenkins, for lack of a better term, in a container itself, but already configured, right? And then again, kind of going back to like DevAssistant, some tool like DevAssistant, could then as well also, whenever you start a new project, whenever you're doing a new feature or whatever, trigger, basically put in the configuration into this container that has your set of tests or your set of whatever continuous integration means for you, right? And then just have a hook inside that container that then goes to the enterprise, or out into some open source land or wherever, right? The point is, you could have that whole tool chain running for you locally that is kind of isolated from everything else, is kind of very easy to set up, right? Because you could just Docker pull your CI infrastructure, and you're off and going, right? On any machine, anywhere in the world, whatever. You can just pick it up and pull it. So part of the way this works is, one of the other kind of container types you need for this, or would want to at least consider for this, is a storage container. Now, the storage container basically is kind of, in a sense, like how all these things communicate with each other. Now, the storage container is interesting because, again, it's a container, so you can do other stuff in there. And you can also, more importantly for me, is you can borrow someone else's rather than having to build all this stuff by hand yourself. So if all of the storage is kind of in one place with the ability to run their own services, well, then you can now just automatically have backup, right? In the sense that somebody who actually knows something about doing backups properly, which is not me, could give me a container, right, that I could just feed it an IP address or something of the remote place that I want the backups to get stored. And now, all of a sudden, I have nicely backed up storage that could be offlineable. And also, what I think is particularly interesting, I don't know about for you, but I end up with a lot of different VMs across multiple hosts kind of when I'm working on a project because for whatever reason, right? But then my source tree, I either need to replicate that all around, or I have to NFS mount it in all different places, or I have to get this kind of connectivity between my the files on my disk and where I want to do work, right? So if you kind of had this thing in this storage container, like I said, you're automatically getting backups, but then you also again are portable, so you can just move that storage around to wherever you want it to be. You can grow it independently of anything else on your OS. What if this storage container was Gluster, right? And then you could have, or Ceph or whatever, any shared distributed storage. Then you could have basically, a brick at your house, right, and a brick at work and a brick on your laptop that are all replicated, that are all running the storage container. I think that starts to get pretty interesting really fast, right? As well as, do you start to think about trying to do versioning on the storage component as well? I think that one I get a little scared of because it gets pretty messy pretty fast, but I think it's an interesting idea. So these are some of the things that I was thinking about. Is this making anybody else think of any things that they would probably want to add into this kind of scenario? Come on, no sleeping. I know it was just lunch. Nothing? Anybody? Come on. Just a pod? Yeah? Right, so, and that's kind of what I was getting at a little bit with the Kubernetes managed, right? Is that then can you also say, hey, you know what? I want to actually have this distributed and deployed across all of these environments. And can we start to get essentially DR tooling, right? So that whenever I plug my laptop in at work, all of the stuff I've been currently working on shifts over to my desktop workstation, right? Because it's got a little bit more horsepower, et cetera. But I don't actually have to think about it, right? It just moves because, that's what they do. So that was kind of the bit I was getting at there. So then we have, unicorns and rainbows. And I just want to shout out again for Unicorn College, which is in Prague. And I think it is the most awesome college that you could possibly imagine. And so I don't know if you go there to learn to be a unicorn or you have to be a unicorn to go there. I'm not sure. But it's totally awesome. So you get this versioning, right, that we talked about a little bit. You get branching because you start to be able to say, okay, this kind of set of the tools is appropriate to, this kind of development environment. The one thing we don't really have kind of in, kind of a Docker container model is, what's it called? No, we have Dan Walsh instead. No, it's basically pushing changes forward through containers. So what you can do with a container, right, is you can kind of endlessly commit it, but you can't go make a change to the earliest one and push that forward. So if you find out that really, really cool new macro that you want to have everywhere, you can't really go and change it in the first one and then push it down, right? There's, if you think about what Docker containers are supposed to be for, there's kind of good reason for that, but, whatever. And then the last bit, portability. I think I've hit on that a bunch. But then the last thing you get also, which I didn't really talk about, I don't think, is scale, right? And so how can you start to now use kind of, because everybody, right, has at least more than one machine, right? They might be physical, they might be in the cloud, they might be whatever. But why not make them all part of the same infrastructure for your development environment? Can we use all these quote unquote, enterprise scale, enterprise class tool chains as individual developers? Because, we're really mean to our computers. And it'd be really nice if we could use some of this tooling that we actually build to actually make our experience a better one. So that's most of my talk. I thought I would get heckled more. So, other questions?
Have you tried it already?
I've done some of it, yeah. So I built I got most of a Firefox sync server running. That is a shockingly hard piece of software to make go. And I've kind of prototyped doing Eclipse inside of a container, and that works pretty well. So yeah, I've done some of them, but then work. So was there another question? Yeah.
I'm mostly interested about this Eclipse in a container because we were Java using debugging Java without an IDE is quite difficult.
Yeah.
So how did you manage?
I just I'm blank. The reason I didn't say the word earlier is I'm blanking on the word. But I basically just did X sharing. Yeah. 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 It's twisted and wrong. Don't it works though. So it's kind of cool. And I think if we see Wayland come along, right, it actually gets a lot easier. So. Oh, sorry. How would you compare this to a normal workflow using Vagrant? I like the default that Vagrant is normal, so the thing is Vagrant. So Vagrant, I think, does part of this, right? At least the way I remember it, and I could be mistaken, and somebody could ask Mitchell themselves. But the way I remember it is that Vagrant was really originally targeting kind of front-end web developers and ones who didn't want to have to learn how to use like VM tools, right? VirtualBox, libvirt, whatever. And so it essentially wraps up creating a VM, putting HTTPD on it, putting PHP libraries on it, whatever, and then NFS mounting back onto your host machine, var dub dub dub. Right? Originally, it was on a Mac and using Ubuntu VMs. Since then, it has grown to do almost anything. I mean, people use it for all kinds of things that I never would have guessed they would use it for. But I guess the thing that Vagrant doesn't do, and what I think is really what I'm trying to get at here, is that I want to move all the tools off my box. Right? Vagrant is actually doing it's almost like it's doing the opposite, right? It makes it so that all your tools can be on your host and still affect the VM, right? So weirdly, I want to get them off the box altogether so that they're portable. Was there another question? I thought I saw somebody else over there. All right, well then there you go. Well, when I convinced Dev Assistant to focus entirely on Dev Assistant and just come to terms with the fact that Python 3 will never be default. So kind of extrapolating, right? So one of the things that Dev Assistant does right now, which is interesting, right, is it allows for the sharing of environment setups, actually kind of like Vagrant does. So you can decide that that guy and that guy over there is an expert in Python, right? And so I can get an assistant that will set up a Python development environment. Okay, so why is that good? Well, because then I'm going to take advantage of all his best practices without having to actually know them. Is there? Right, you could. The thing is that it has a nice wrapper around it, right? And for 80% of the developers out there, if it doesn't have a nice wrapper around it, it doesn't get used. Like LXC, right? Until Docker came along, right? Which made a nice wrapper around Linux containers. Or as I threatened many years ago, somebody had written this really cool UML to Java converter, and nobody ever used it because it had a command line with 300 switches. So I threatened them with writing a VB installer, and so then like a week later there was a Java installer. So basically, something like Dev Assistant, what it can do, right, is it can say, without any like kind of really strong particular knowledge of the environment you want to set up, you can actually then pull down these containers that have the development environment that's already set up, and you can use it to for your thing. And we got to remember that like the kind of stuff I'm thinking about is trying to target the everyday developer. The people who like I still remember an example of a guy who used to work for me. I didn't hire him, who was running into that classic Java issue that I think is finally fixed on Windows, where you run out of length of path, and so Java falls over because Windows has a cap on the length of the path, and Java likes really long paths. And he didn't know where the files were stored because he just used them in Eclipse. He didn't actually know where on disk Eclipse was putting the files. I was just like, really? But I would not say that's atypical. Yeah. Magic. So the question was basically like, so if you start to develop this kind of environment, right, how do you maintain the fact that now you've got 67 containers all running on your laptop, and what the hell is actually installed? So I don't know, and the problem is here that, or my hope here is that we're already seeing sysadmins who have gone from needing to manage 100 servers, so like one person used to manage 100 servers, right? Even less, right? Now they need to manage 1,000, 10,000, right? Especially if you mix in containers. So the tooling to make that go is coming, right? Some of it's here, right? If you came, I think the talk before this one was using Foreman to manage containers. So you start to need tools like that, right? But we're going to need it anyway because we need, your whole desktop is going to turn into a networked OS, right? Soon. So we have to have ways to manage those tools. But yeah, that's UI skills way beyond me.
So
A standard for what? Sorry, I'm not sure.
Buyer doesn't get a setup computer. They get to use it everything level.
Oh, well, so I think, so Red Hat actually does do a standard, right, that you get a standard component. It's not particularly good for developers, but you do get a standard image, right? Almost every company does a standard image. Almost no company that I've ever heard of does a standard developer image. And then there are some, but not very many. Then on top of that, what we're seeing even more, right, is actually, what's referred to as BYOD, right? So more and more companies are encouraging their employees to bring their own computers, right? Sometimes they just give them a pile of money and say, go buy one, do whatever, get whatever you want. I actually think something like this actually makes it even better, right? Because then, if the developer, buys a Mac, right? Or he buys, he puts Fedora on there, or he uses Windows, or he uses Ubuntu, or he uses whatever, all this stuff just works, right? Well, maybe some of the X windowing stuff, but, but you can do it with Spice, right? So that's kind of what I think. But anybody else? Oh, yeah.
All the services are running external. Is there a chance that I could use my, for instance, Android tablet as a working, as a
Right.
development machine?
So the question was basically, if you have all this stuff running as containers and managed in a hyperscale sort of way, that means that then I could use a tablet to do development work, right? Or a phone, or whatever. Because you can, in theory, just shift the loads around, right? And yeah, I think that gets really interesting. I'm not sure what it'll mean. I'm not sure if anybody would want to do it. But I think what I think is interesting about this idea is that you open up a whole new world of possibilities, right? And things that I haven't thought of, probably will never think of, that all of you might think of, that we could do that would actually improve developers' efficiency by tons. And then we really will have unicorns and rainbows, right? So that's the goal, right? I'm just trying to say, here's an idea. Here's a way we could do this. And I'm taking a stab at parts of it. Let me know if you want to take a stab at parts of it. And, let's just see what happens, right? That's kind of the idea. All right, is that it? Next time I will insert random lines of code in the middle. All right, cool. Thanks for coming.
Please.
Should I fix the attributions first? No, see, the problem is I just put links in because I was going to go back and clean up the attributions. I just didn't get a chance yet. I'll get it to you later. You can find me. See, my talks are too conceptual for this crowd.
Yeah, I think it made sense. They just don't have anything to grab and try.
Right. But these are the kinds of talks I like. Oh, yeah. So did you like the shout out? Oops.
Yeah.
It's not. Plug in here. Don't drink my water.
Dám ti to přepnout, chceš to
A
jako
já
vidět,
bych
jak
si
to
chtěl,
vypadá?
jako abych viděl třeba, jak bude velký, wow. Bych viděl, jak bude velký terminál a so it looks like it's okay. Is it a good talk? Yeah. Okay. Okay. Kolik ukazujete času? Ukazujete 10 minut před
10
koncem?
minut a 5 minut.
10 a 5 minut.
Jako jestli chceš, tak ti
A je
klidně
to-
zamávám i 15, mám 2 papíry. Tak
Je to 40, jo?
no,
Jo, zamáváme 15, já jsem rád, když jako vím celkem přesně, kde jsem. ale je to tak nějaký místní trošku. Ale to nevadí, mám tam jenom kabrda a ne kabrda.
Aha, ono to dělá, no.
Ale to asi nevadí.
A ještě jaký tam máš rozlišení? Jo,
Ale jaký tam rozlišení? Prostě rozlišení.
ono totiž
A nejde mě, jako chtěl jsem si to původně zvedovat, ale pak jsem si všiml, že to mám vlastně tady, což je super docela. Jako to je fakt geniální tohle.
je, no.
Myslím, že už je to dost velkýho ještě.
Já myslím, že v pohodě, já myslím, že dáme si až za dvou.
Tak to je dobrý, až na to, že mě to nechce ukázat prezentaci na tom, tyjo. Počkej, když možná. Jo, teď mě to ukazuje tady na tom primární. Počkej, hele víš co, ale já už asi vím moment. Já už asi vím.
A máš jenom šel?
SKDčko, počkej, zkusím.
A nejde to nějak tam už nějak přepnout, ne?
Já jsem už teďka řekl jako, že... Vidíš, pořád mě to hází sem?
Ale tam to myslím, že to tam už to nějak... Dej
Já už
tam,
jsem mu tady nastavil, že jako display.
dej při slideshow.
Jakože když dám tohle, tak teď dělal všeho víc na brýle.
No právě, no, že tam nemáš ten, a tam to nedá přepnout totiž.
Je to tak jáčko tady to?
No.
Protože já mám, že to možná pojďme přes ten...
Ale jako je to jáčko, no.
Nejde to jako vůbec přesně.
Když jsem musel, že tam jenom přehodíš.
No. Takový je, a je to jaký vrchní, ne?
Trošku jo, no.
Ale už se tam dostává.
Tak tam
ne?
určitě si mít rozlišení.
Má si špatný
1024 na 768 ideál.
to mě ani... On mi tady tvrdí, že jako prostě je tady jenom auto a nevím, jak se mě tam ukázat. Jako možná přesvědčit Sandr by to možná šlo, ale já do toho asi radši nebudu kopat, nebo se to rozsype úplně celý. Jako.
No, ono i tady je to takový.
No, je to,
Momentík, já něco zkusím.
No.
Je to lepší?
Víte? Jo, to je ono.
Jo, je to teda menší.
Jo, to je v pohodě, já si myslím. A ještě si trošku zvýším tady v tom. A pomoc. Jo, super, díky moc.
Jinak pokud budete chtít si, tak i tohle stojí bez jakéhokoliv hesla.
Jo, to by bylo i dobrý, no.
Takže přes tu Wi-Fi, no.
Jo.
A budete muset kousíček ke mně.
Dobrý, to si zvládnu, takže. Dobrý.
Tohle stojí gigová síť, takže tam by to už mělo chodit.
To by mohlo být dobrý, no.
Ta Wi-Fi Wi-Fi, protože spoustu lidí připojených, tak začíná
Ale moc
dostávat...
to nejde, jasně. Jo, dobrý, jede.
No s těma písmenkama asi nikdy nedělám.
No, to už jako... A takhle to je?
Tohle to je
To je dobrý. Já to jako víc nepotřebuju.
A když je to takhle dobrý, tak...
Jo, jo.